The movie opens with a team of US government agents arriving at a trailer in a deserted area after receiving reports of an extraterrestrial object that had landed there. They speak to a Spanish-speaking eyewitness who keeps repeating the word rebirth in Spanish. Agent Steep asks what he means by rebirth, but the witness doesn't elaborate. Remarkably, this man, who was previously blind, has somehow regained his sight. Agent Steep heads outside to investigate the area where the object supposedly landed, but by then it's already gone. Elsewhere, David Chamberlain, a mechanic who lost his wife some time ago, visits her grave, talking to her about their daughter. On his way to work, a news report airs about more troops being sent for Operation Terminus, a US mission to occupy Iran. At work, David talks to his boss, Ned Wilcox, who informs him that the shop is about to shut down. As David leaves his boss's office, he notices a young man, Zach, hanging around one of the cars. Zach is looking for a job, but David tells him that this isn't the right place and drives away. That night, David heads to a local bar to have drinks with his co-workers, taking in the bad news about work. Zach is also there, but he gets provoked by some racist remarks from another patron and goes outside, where a fight breaks out between him and the man, along with his friend. David, seeing the brawl, tries to intervene, but he and Zach both end up getting beaten up. The men walk off after noticing Zach's prosthetic leg, revealing he's a war veteran from Iraq. David retrieves Zach's prosthetic leg and offers him a ride, trying to talk some sense into him, but Zach is too frustrated to listen. David drops him off at his motel and heads home. When David arrives home, he sees a cake his daughter, Annabelle, who is home from college, made for his birthday. Disappointed in himself for forgetting, he apologizes. She notices his bruises, and he brushes it off, lying about the fight. As she tends to his wounds, he realizes she brought all her belongings home and asks if she left college. She explains that she had to leave because her last 2 tuition payments weren't made. He promises he'll find a way to get her back in school, but she refuses to see him work himself into exhaustion. After giving him a birthday gift, a watch, with an engraving on the back expressing her love, she heads to bed. Upset, David reaches for a bottle, but it's empty. So he decides to go out and get some more drinks. While driving, a brilliant light appears in the sky, causing him to crash. Disoriented and bleeding, he stumbles out of the car, his vision blurry, and follows a figure of a girl into the forest. The next morning, Annabelle wakes up and goes to check on her dad, but his bed is empty. She tries calling the police, but since it hasn't been 24 hours, they can't file a report. She goes to his workplace, but no one there has seen him either. On her way back, she spots his wrecked car and heads into the woods to search, but she still can't find him. Just as she's about to give up, David suddenly appears, standing in front of her. She rushes him to the hospital, where his friends join her in the waiting room. The doctor emerges and asks about David's health history, specifically about the kidney he once donated to his late wife, which her body rejected, ultimately leading to her death. The doctor explains that the tests reveal David now has 2 perfectly healthy kidneys, an impossibility. A few days later, David is discharged from the hospital. As he sits in the chair that once belonged to his wife, he recalls the events of the night of his accident. After the crash, he had dragged himself to the spot where the mysterious object landed, and a strange alien entity had made contact with him. While he lay unconscious, David now finds himself having dinner with his daughter, Annabelle, who watches him closely, still shaken by what the doctor told her. She mentions that, while he was in the hospital, he kept calling out for her mother and spoke to her as if she were right there. David merely stares back in silence, offering no response. Later that night, as Annabelle sleeps and the news discusses the ongoing war, David hears his late wife's voice calling to him. He steps outside, following the voice, and encounters an apparition of her. She encourages him not to lose hope, but rather to create it for their daughter. He experiences flashes of what seems like impending devastation. Driven by this vision, David heads to a storage shed next to their house and becomes deeply engrossed in building something, believing the mysterious object that caused his accident was sending him messages through his wife's spirit. Meanwhile, at a secret government facility, Agent Epstein has a serious conversation with Agent Steep about the pursuit of an unknown object amidst the war. After orders come down to shut down the facility, Epstein reminds Steep of his former role as Army intelligence for 4 years before joining the agency. suggesting his skills are needed on the front lines. But Agent Stipp, believing this discovery could change everything and even turn the tide of the war, argues that his current work is more critical. Meanwhile, the research team is investigating an alien specimen found at the original crash site, and they closely monitor the witness, Mr. Gutierrez. After reporting no useful findings from external examination, the team considers dissecting the specimen. Despite warnings of the high risks involved, Stipp authorizes the procedure. When asked what to tell the man's wife if something goes wrong, Stipe suggests explaining that her husband died heroically, having succumbed to a heart attack while attempting to contain a lethal virus, a sacrifice that saved the country from a potential epidemic. Back at David's house, he uncovers an old car that once belonged to his wife. Upon seeing a vision of her sitting in the driver's seat, he is overcome with emotion. He takes the car out for a drive, while Annabelle watches old videos of her mother, bringing back fond memories and tears. Meanwhile, Zach, a war veteran, sits with his friend Jim, who is injured but eager to return to combat. Zach expresses that he would rather die than return to war, but Jim argues that going back is better than dealing with the endless sympathy and pity he faces at home. In the midst of this conversation, David approaches Zach and hires him to help retrieve the strange object. They head to the crash site, where David sets up a towing winch and instructs Zach to operate it. David descends to the object, noticing the strange way its branches seem to move. He secures the object and signals Zach to pull it up. While loading it onto the truck, Zach touches the object, feeling an indescribable sensation pass through him. Though he can't fully explain it, they leave the crash site, and David takes the object to his barn, where he obsessively begins constructing something. The object glows faintly, and Annabelle becomes increasingly aware of her father's peculiar fixation with the barn at night. While Annabelle watches the news, David notices she has packed her mother's clothes into boxes, ready to give them away. She's eager for a fresh start and to move forward. David picks up one of his late wife's favorite garments and hands it back to her, gently reminding Annabelle that she doesn't need to erase her mother's memory to move on. His words unsettle her a little. Meanwhile, Zach, back at the veterans shelter, suddenly experiences intense pain in his amputated leg. Looking closer, he's shocked to see that his leg is actually beginning to grow back. The next day, while helping his friend Jim, who is skeptical of Zach's intentions, Zach feels the pain returning. Jim dismisses it as phantom pain, but Zach senses it's something far more real. Later, Zach joins a protest with other veterans against the war, voicing their opposition loudly outside an army office. During a scuffle with a local man, Zach's pain escalates, and he starts bleeding from his regrowing leg. At the barn, David is fixated on the alien object, noting how it reacts differently to sunlight. He's soon interrupted by Zach, who arrives on crutches and bleeding heavily. Zach demands to know what the object has done to him, but collapses before he can say more. David brings him into the house, where Annabelle, who followed the trail of blood, bursts in, thinking her father is injured. Shocked to see Zach bleeding and in pain on the couch, she insists on taking him to a hospital. David, however, shows her Zach's leg, which is painfully regenerating. Annabelle is stunned, watching as the limb slowly rebuilds itself. After some rest, Zach wakes from a nightmare of the incident, where he lost his leg. Meanwhile, David, needing coolant for the object, enlists Annabelle's help to carry Zach closer to the object. He attaches the coolant to the object, explaining it was suffering in the heat. As they position Zach near it, the object's branches start to wrap around his arm, accelerating his healing. Zach's leg regenerates rapidly, overwhelming Annabelle, who faints at the sight. At the same time, Agent Stipp and his team, originally en route to Philadelphia, receive word of a new alien object crash to the northeast, close to David's town. Stipp feels certain he can gain the cooperation of Sheriff William to investigate further. The following morning, Annabelle wakes from a dream of waiting for her father in the hospital next to her dying mother, her hand in hers. She checks her hands, uncertain of what's real, and goes to the window, where she sees Zach standing and walking on both legs. He appears both thrilled and awestruck. Once his initial excitement passes, he sits down with Annabelle over coffee. She's still trembling from the previous night, but Zach reassures her, saying things will be alright. When she asks how he feels, he admits he has mixed emotions, but is ultimately grateful. The two then head to the barn, where they find David sketching a massive structure he believes the object is urging him to create. Feeling indebted for the miracle of his restored leg, Zach agrees to help David. Though Annabelle remains apprehensive, she questions David's unwavering devotion to the object since he first discovered it. David tries to ease her worries, explaining that the structure is meant to protect them from an inevitable catastrophe, urging her to trust him. David realizes he'll need a significant amount of steel to complete the structure and, without a job, decides to exploit his friend Tony. First, he asks Tony for a single steel bar as a small favor, which Tony willingly provides. Later, David takes Tony out for drinks and gets him intoxicated. They briefly talk about how Annabelle is coping with her mother's passing. Once Tony is thoroughly drunk, David helps him to his car, slyly takes Tony's keys from his pocket, and heads to the junkyard with Zach. On their way, they spot Agent Steep and his team investigating the crash site. Reaching the junkyard, David and Zach hurriedly load steel onto their truck, even managing to steal a cement mixer to transport the supplies to an abandoned warehouse where they begin their work without delay. The following morning, Tony wakes up in his car, unaware that David had returned his keys after the theft. Meanwhile, Agent Steep's team, accompanied by Sheriff Epstein, is analyzing the crash site. They discover a fragment of the object that resembles the one they already have in their lab. Sheriff William, who knows about David's car accident near this area, mentions it as an interesting coincidence. Steepy, however, doesn't believe in coincidences and sees this as a promising lead. The team isolates the sample in a plastic enclosure, observing branches similar to those on the main object. The scientists note that the sample contains genetic material resembling both plant and animal DNA, with some strands even appearing human. This suggests that the sample is a living organism, exhibiting characteristics of biogenesis, the origin of life from pre-existing sources. While David and Zach are tirelessly working on the project in the warehouse, Annabelle visits her mother's grave. She confides her confusion about her father's recent behavior, expressing resentment toward him despite his efforts to provide her with a good life. Tearfully, she tells her mother how much she misses her and places a flower at the gravesite. Meanwhile, back at the barn, David and Zach weld and forge the structure, eventually securing the object within the metal enclosure they've built. Agent Stipe and his team soon arrive at David's house, where they find Annabelle preparing to burn some of her mother's belongings. Just before she lights the match, Steep introduces himself as Agent Julian Stipe from a scientific agency and inquires about her father's location. Annabelle replies that she doesn't know, but Steep goes into the house to wait. When David eventually returns, he recounts the events leading to the car crash, describing a light falling from the sky before everything went black. Steep attempts to sway David by explaining the potential scientific benefits of the object for others in need, even mentioning David's new kidney. He then shows David a photo of Mr. Gutierrez, the witness who died when Steep's scientists performed an experiment on him, cautioning David that the object might not be as healing as he believes. Realizing that Steep won't give up, David leads them to the barn. However, he claims the object melted due to the heat, as he had already moved it to the structure at the warehouse. Steep thanks David and leaves. That night, Annabelle confronts her father about the men who came asking for the object. She knows he still has it and fears they'll harm him as they did the witness. David shares a vision he had, supposedly shown to him by his late wife, foretelling an imminent catastrophe. But Annabelle believes the object is manipulating her father's mind and suspects he's refusing to accept her mother's death. Annabelle firmly tells David that her mother is gone, sharing a vision she had of her mother lying in the hospital, waiting for him in her final moments. After a heated argument, Annabelle leaves, disappointed that David still cannot come to terms with her mother's death. The next morning, David awakens from a nightmare of a fire consuming everything, including Annabelle standing helplessly before him. He checks on Annabelle and then heads to the abandoned warehouse, noticing a car tailing him along the way. David quickly calls his friend Mickey for help. David veers into a residential area, turns down a side street, and stops. Mickey jumps into David's car and begins driving in circles to confuse the tail. Frustrated, Agent Steep orders David's arrest, but upon realizing David isn't driving, he instructs his team to detain Annabelle instead. Meanwhile, Tony is confronted about the missing steel and cement mixer. Security footage shows David involved, and Tony's boss demands the truck's immediate return to the junkyard. At the warehouse, Zach notices the object glowing and, while staring at it, relives the horrors of losing his legs. The agonizing memories overwhelm him until David arrives and finds him transfixed. Later, Zach meets Annabelle in a hallway, and they talk about the time Annabelle's mother fell ill. As her mum's condition worsened, David threw himself into his work, reminding her of his current obsession. Annabelle also mentions the agents looking for the object. Zach promises to take her to David but introduces her to Jim first, who remains skeptical of Zach's regenerated leg. Shortly after they leave the hospital, agents intercept and detain them. Meanwhile, Tony tracks David to the warehouse and confronts him over the junkyard theft, demanding an explanation about the structure. David fumbles for an answer, and Tony, frustrated, reaches for his phone to call the police. A struggle ensues as David tries to grab the phone, and in the chaos, David accidentally kicks Tony, causing him to fall backward and hit his head fatally on the edge of a steel table. Disturbed by the accidental death, David retreats into the metal structure and sits next to the object. He experiences another vision and embraces his wife, who asks about Annabelle. David explains that Annabelle no longer trusts him, and he confesses about Tony's accident. She tells him to find Annabelle and Zach, saying they're the only ones destined to survive the impending catastrophe. Warning him that time is running out, she fades away, leaving him alone once more. Meanwhile, Agent Steep holds Annabelle and Zach captive in David's living room. The news broadcasts a report of a missile attack from Russia on a U.S. military base at Terminus. Agent Stipe tries to persuade Zach, handcuffed to a chair, of the object's potential to benefit soldiers and even end the war. Zach remains silent, so Stipe turns to Annabelle, who insists the object is far from there. In a final, desperate attempt, Agent Steep resorts to torture and begins beating Zach outside the house. David arrives just in time, witnessing the brutal scene. Enraged, he distracts the other agent by setting fire to the pile Annabelle had prepared to burn her mother's clothes, allowing him to enter the house and confront Steep with a gun pointed directly at his head. David orders him to toss the handcuff keys to Annabelle, who frees Zach, then strikes Agent Steep, knocking him unconscious. They manage to escape, but just as they're leaving, Steep fires, hitting Annabelle in the back. With no choice, David must now take her to the object for healing. Zach drives as fast as he can, while David, shaken and emotional, cares for his wounded daughter in the back seat. Meanwhile, Steep and his partner pursue them. Steep's partner is skeptical, suggesting the object isn't meant to be a weapon. But Steep is adamant, believing it can still be harnessed for victory in a war that is now on the brink of nuclear devastation. Annabelle is losing blood, but she manages to whisper the same words David's wife had spoken in his vision. The words strike David deeply, and he begins to cry. They finally reach the warehouse. David carries Annabelle into the metal structure next to the alien object, but it shows no response. Frustrated, he becomes angry, just as Agent Steep and his partner arrive, forcing David to leave Annabelle with the object. Thinking his daughter has passed, David makes a decision: he will burn the object down. As he lights his lighter, ready to destroy everything, Annabelle suddenly calls out to him. David quickly closes the lighter, but Steep shoots him in cold blood. In response, Zach fires at the agents, injuring them both. Amid the chaos, Steep's partner turns on him, and Zach takes a bullet in the shoulder. Suddenly, a distant explosion shakes the ground, signaling the unthinkable: a nuclear bomb has been dropped. With time running out, David tells Zach to protect Annabelle, orders him to get into the metal structure, and tearfully apologizes to Annabelle, saying he can't go with them. He seals the structure's door, choosing to stay behind and face the end. Inside, organic material coats the structure's walls, and Annabelle and Zach are soon submerged in water as it fills up, placing them in cryogenic suspension. Centuries later, the door opens, and Annabelle and Zach awaken, finding the world around them in ruins.